57talk.com. Gary Cubetta back with you again, Scottsdale, Arizona, and it's my pleasure to introduce, from Texas, famed wrestling commentator from the 1980s, Marc Lowrance. Marc, pleasure to have you with us.
Great to be here.
Marc, we talked off the air a few days ago, and I said that I grew up watching you on Saturday nights, listening to your commentary on World-Class Championship Wrestling, and I realized we're about the same age. You started in wrestling when you were 21 years old in the early 1980s.
Well, now, this is forbidden territory, Gary. I'm vain and egotistical, and I lie about my age. And, I think I was more like about 12 years old when I started that.
You were 12. Is that legal?
Probably not, but
Marc,
it was wrestling.
Marc, were you a big fan of wrestling before you got involved?
I was not. I'd never been.
And Boyd Pierce, who had been the ring announcer in Texas, and he had been so for many, many years, and I knew Boyd back in the 1970s, he left to join Bill Watts in Mid-South, and Boyd was there, and you took advantage of it and became ring announcer. Were you excited to get that job?
No, and it all happened by accident. And I remember hearing of Boyd Pierce. He used to wear jackets that were made out of drapery material. They were wild and colorful and part of his trademark. And there were many great stories about him that I heard about once I got there, but I never met him.
So you're not a fan of the wrestling business. You get in there. You've got the dream job that any young guy would love who's a wrestling fan. You're right in the middle of the ring. What'd you think when you first became part of this thing?
Well, I was just confused because I got the job strictly by accident, and I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know who any of the characters were. Bronco Lubitsch, who was working in promotion and working as a referee in those days, had to tell me who the wrestlers were, and then I would introduce them. Mind you, I was just doing public address or ring announcing, no TV at that point.
And Marc, that really surprises me because you were such a natural inside the ring. You had a very subtle approach, but there was a drama in the way you'd even introduce wrestlers. I remember I spoke with Mickey Grant the other day, and he had spoken about how he had filmed Live in the Arena, Reunion Arena, and I remember very clearly you doing the ring announcing. You were good. Did you know you were good at it?
Well, that's a very high compliment. No, I didn't. In fact, I was very nervous. See, I was just a senior in college when that happened, and you're forcing me now to be more honest about my age, but I was one of the few people bright enough in this world to cram a 4-year college program into 4.5 years. So this was summer of what should have been after my senior year in graduation at TCU, but I was going to go back that fall to finish up, and I was looking for summer work. And I had done radio work. I'd done sports for the Texas State Network. I had been the hockey PA announcer for the minor league hockey team that was a New York Islander affiliate in Fort Worth for several years. And there was a local sports anchor with one of the TV channels that was a big hockey buff who came to the games, who was very complimentary of my work, who called me that day. One June day in my little efficiency one-room apartment there, bachelor pad, college guy pad in Fort Worth, and said, hey, there's a PA job open in the area. Are you interested? And I respected him and was thrilled with it, and I thought he was referring to the Dallas Cowboys or the Dallas Mavericks or the Texas Rangers, and I said, sure. And he said, well, Fritz von Erich is going to call you. And my heart just sank, wrestling. No way. I made up my mind I wasn't going to do it. But I thanked him, and I didn't tell him that. And then, like later that day, this imposing voice on the telephone identifying himself as Fritz von Erich, wanting me to come to work. And the deal was the guy I was replacing, which evidently was an interim after Boyd Pierce, I was told was going to go to Europe for 3 weeks to sing on a music tour. And he was just looking for somebody for 3 weeks, 3 Mondays in Fort Worth and 3 Fridays at the Sportatorium in Dallas. Well, for 3 weeks, what did I have to lose? And he was generous with what he was going to pay for no more work that was involved. And so I agreed to do it. And I went over there not knowing what I was doing, afraid it was a shady fly-by-night operation. And what I found was very nice people, gracious people, complimentary people, cooperative, supportive people who made my experience with them very pleasant. And after the 3 Mondays in Fort Worth and the 3 Fridays in Dallas, I thanked them and said, hey, if you need me again, give me a call. And that was on a Friday night. And the following Monday, I was sitting down to dinner at my mother and father's house. And it was Fritz von Erich's secretary saying, there's been a mistake. We need you tonight. And so I quickly cleaned up and put on a tie and went down there, and the rest was history. I stayed with him for 10 years, and I never knew what happened to the guy I was replacing. I've often suspected that Fritz was just saying that as a protective measure in case I didn't work out, because Fritz had a soft side. Or maybe the guy just changed his mind and never wanted to come back. But either way, I wound up with something that I was going to be able to grow into, and it became fun real fast.
It did become fun, which means that to some extent you became a fan of the product, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
But to go back to your question earlier,
yeah.
I was so nervous about this and trying to get it right and trying to learn how this worked that I really was pretty tight. In fact, Fritz told me one day, he said, Mark, you're sounding great out there, but you don't look too good. Go stand in front of a mirror and smile and practice some of the inflection that's in your voice facially. And the people are going to think you're arrogant, and you're not. You're just nervous. But, just relax and be yourself and let people in, and that will help this crowd accept you. And that's exactly what I did, and that's exactly what happened.
And accept you they did, because I think you were a very important part of the incredible growth of World Class early on. At what point did you start to get an interest in the product itself?
Well, I was doing the PA, or the ring announcing, for these 2 deals, and at that time, we just had a live wrestling show in Dallas. I think it was then on Sundays. I think I said Fridays. It moved to Fridays quickly, but at the outset, I think it was actually on Sunday. The only TV work we did was in Fort Worth on Channel 11, and Bill Mercer was doing the television commentary. He was the TV host. Well, as I got to know people and it became fun and everybody was so nice and complimentary, Bill was missing an awful lot of those tapings because Bill was still doing some basketball, and Bill, unbeknownst to me, was involved in the early plannings with Mickey Grant of what was going to be that syndicated show that was going to be done out of 39. I knew nothing about that. And the guys that they were having replace Bill were just awful. And I would sit there and listen to them, and they knew less about it than I did. And I knew enough about hockey and broadcasting that I just felt like I could do better than that. And so I just approached Fritz one Monday night in Fort Worth, and I said, hey, Bill's a busy guy. He's got a great career, and he's gone a lot. How about giving me a chance at the television? And the very next Monday night, Fritz gave me that opportunity. And so I was Bill's fill-in for several months. And then when the syndicated show was ready to go up, the promotion, all of them agreed, with Bill included, that Bill was going to go be the syndicated guy as the senior and experienced and better broadcaster, and then I would take over Channel 11. And then I got real interested in helping Channel 11 compete with the higher production, and so we did some work on our end to bring in a mini cam down on the floor and some post-production, which the original show had not had, and it just became a great deal. And then I would still do the introductions and the PA work with Bill doing TV in Dallas.
Now, this was on Channel 11 from Fort Worth, Texas. It was a Saturday night. It was a 2-hour show, so you had to carry the broadcast for 2 hours. Was it difficult when you first started to have a dialogue? You were doing it solo, no color commentator, right?
Well, that's correct. I was solo, but the show was only an hour and a half. We expanded to 2 hours after I had been doing it a year or so because the ratings were so high and the thing was just going through the ceiling. But no, I never had any trouble with that. They prepared me well for what we were about on any particular night. Gary Hart, who was the booker, and then later Ken Mantell, they were both great guys. They treated me like a king. And they had me well prepared, and then anything I needed, they were so accessible. we were ready to go. It was just fun.
Now, you were in World Class as it grew, the growth phase. Mark, take us back. How popular was World Class with the fans during the absolute peak, Kerry and Flair and those 82, 83?
Well, it was amazing. And I have a private side, always have, and there are times that I enjoy privacy in my world. And the fact that I wasn't living a private life anymore was hard for me to adjust to because people really were interested. Younger people, blue-collar people, the core wrestling group, they were just mad about this, like it was the Super Bowl every week. And even more sophisticated, educated people that you normally didn't associate with that fan base were taking an interest in it because it was so well done, it was so much fun, and there was so much interest in it. I remember dating my oldest son's mother and sitting in a booth in restaurants, and people would come up and start talking to me as if though they had known me all my life. I didn't know who they were, but because they knew me through television and knew the promotion, they just felt like we were family, and they felt like they could approach me, which was fine. But, it was hard to have privacy in that time because it was big stuff. And to think that Reunion Arena was new at the time and hosting the Dallas Mavericks and hockey wasn't there yet, we would literally sell that place out and turn people away for our holiday events. And we're talking with seats on the floor, well over 20,000 people. And the Sportatorium you could not get into for months. We sold out for months at a time, maybe a year and a half. Every Friday, rain or shine, no air conditioning, limited heat, rodents, bench seats, dirty, worn-out building with asbestos in the ceiling and horrible decayed wiring. It's just amazing. And it was just rocking every Friday night.
Well, it didn't come across that way on TV. As a viewer, I thought that this was, the state-of-the-art arena, the Sportatorium at least, in Texas. It looked beautiful on TV. Let me ask you, Mark, you're in Reunion Arena. You see 20,000 fans. You're doing the ring announcing. You look up. What are you thinking? Can you believe that professional wrestling has this kind of interest?
Yes. By the time we got there, we knew what we were in for, so it wasn't a surprise. And I quickly learned that talking to 25,000 people is no different than talking to 25. Just do it the same. Be yourself. And so it was fun.
Now, World Class was blessed with some true superstars, guys that if they were alive today or wrestling today would be on top of WWE, no question. Did you, when you'd see the in-ring style of Kevin Von Erich, Kerry Von Erich, even the great Kabuki, did you know that? Did you appreciate the talent?
Not completely. That grew with time as I began to see an alternative. When all you have is the best, sometimes you don't realize how good the best is until you have something to compare it to. And so that appreciation experience was something that I grew into as I learned more and got more comfortable and adjusted to what I was doing.
What other product did you see to compare it to?
Well,
earliest memories of...
It would be some of the spot shows with the same promotion, but they would bring me in for whatever the reason into one of the smaller communities, one of the charity shows where the gate was being split with a promotion or an organization. That was going on, and every now and then they would have me come. And those promotions would bring in some of the big names, but they would also use some local talent from that area or some talent that did not get on television. And so I would watch that, and then that would help me understand the skill level of these big-name pros that were a part of that burgeoning movement with World Class.
Was there one particular star who you said, oh, my gosh, this is just the absolute best in the business, 82, 83?
I thought Bruiser Brody was absolutely outstanding. I thought Ric Flair was absolutely top-notch. Both of those guys, not only for what they did in the ring, but the way they presented themselves and the business when they were out of the ring.
David Von Erich, many said that he was going to be the next NWA champion. Did you see the same level of talent in him?
I think so, but what I saw most in David was a mean, tough side that his father emulated when he was in the ring. And then beyond the ring, David was the one who had the fire and the desire to inherit that empire as his daddy phased out into semi-retirement and then later retirement. Had David lived, you and I would be living in a very different world with regards to the pro wrestling business today than what we see.
Why? How?
Well, when we lost David, we lost that figure who was going to be the heir apparent to the throne. Not that others weren't in line for it, but they didn't have the gifts and graces that David had to run that thing with the aggressive energy and passion that he had. The other personalities within that Von Erich family were different personalities. Great guys, great wrestlers, but they did not have that business head and that competitive passion to be the businessman that promotion needed.
Do you think that Fritz didn't see the potential in what he had in 82 and 83? The thing was just so red hot. And if David had been there, a younger force in the family, would have pushed things ahead. Is that?
I think probably Fritz at first was as surprised as anybody with how well it was doing, but Fritz was high on his boys, and he always felt like that his boys were the reason that thing was doing what it was, and that as long as he had those boys, the sky was the limit. There was an underestimation, in my opinion, from the Von Erich family for the quality of talent that was there helping those Von Erich boys succeed. The Flair who would come in, the Brody who was a regular, the fabulous Freebirds. I mean, what a team. What guys. The way they complemented each other. One's strength offset their weakness. They just had the charisma and the personality. Gorgeous Jimmy Garvin, Chris Adams, I mean...
Gino Hernandez.
Gino Hernandez. You just can't underestimate what those guys brought. Fritz's big issue was, after David died, it was demoralizing and sad and discouraging. But it was move on because you had Kerry and you had Kevin and Mike was going to come along and... there was still great hope, and it wasn't until we were a year past that we really began to realize that something was missing. And when Fritz's empire continued to go forward, Fritz was at a stage of life where, struggling with some of his own journey issues, as well as David's death and his boys' struggles outside the ring, Fritz got involved in a very religious side of his life. And in all of that, whether it was a relationship with God, something within himself, Fritz had this incredible reluctance not to run against his neighboring promoters. He just couldn't go in and run against them. It was a family, a loyalty, an air of camaraderie that he had all his life, as he had, bought that promotion years before out of the Houston organization. And he would send his guys in to complement their card and let them do well with a gate, but Fritz never could come in and run against his fellow promoters. Because for years, all these promoters had their own territories, and they had their own television. And Marc Lowrance could be a good guy in Dallas and then be a heel in Portland, Oregon, and then go be a babyface in Florida and then go to Pennsylvania and be a heel again, and no one necessarily knew that. But when Fritz's show, World Class, started going syndicated and was being seen in everybody else's market, identities began to change and territorial boundaries began to fall because those people saw what was happening out of that Dallas office, and they wanted that. And all of Fritz's promoters under him, all of the TV people, everybody in his world was saying, Fritz, this is a new day. You've got to seize this moment. If you don't, someone else will. And this is your opportunity. Don't let it slip through your fingers like sand. And Fritz could never bring himself to do what Turner and McMahon wound up doing, which was literally run in and compete against those territories. And that really was as big, if not greater, an impact decision than David's death, because once people began to see that there was this ceiling that Fritz had imposed with this ethic, they wouldn't stay in the office.
Oh, boy.
And so the Freebirds left and went elsewhere, and Jimmy Garvin left and went elsewhere, and Gino, and, and then you'd have to start and rebuild it again, and then your promoters start getting frustrated, and then you've got competition in your backyard, and you're not as strong as you were 18 months ago to run against it because they've got some of the people that used to be here, and that began the decline.
Mark, now I know you would just be guessing with this, but do you think that Fritz didn't want to go into the other territories from an ethical point of view, or he didn't want to go into the other territories because he was afraid that they would come into his territory?
I don't know. He had no reason, in my opinion, to be afraid of that because, he had the cat's meow. I think personally, and I say this compassionately, I'm a United Methodist minister now. I say this out of compassion. I think Fritz was a man of deep inner struggles. I think he dealt with a lot of issues within himself. And the nature of the religion that he connected with was more of a punishment and reward type of theology as opposed to just grace and God loves you. And so I think he was afraid of the consequences. I feel like he thought that there may have been a message from God to him in David's death. And then after we started seeing that with Mike and his struggles and near death and then his death that came later, Fritz, without a doubt, was afraid of that this was punishment for stuff in his life. And so he was afraid then to do anything but be rather passive with his promotion. And no one understood that. They were exasperated. They were frustrated. There are still people today who are angry that they feel like they missed life's opportunity because Fritz would not send that thing on to the top.
Was there a moment where you were sitting there at ringside thinking, if we went national with this and started to go into big arenas across the country, nothing could hold this back? Was there one point in time where you remember thinking that?
No, because the stuff I'm sharing with you now is stuff that I had to realize from hindsight in years later. I was not in those inner circle meetings with Ken Mantell, Mickey Grant, Fritz, David Manning, where those discussions were taking place. That's an area that I was not involved with. So I had to rely on my own experience and conjecture from watching. And it's when the thing began to struggle that I could look back and say, yeah, here's what happened. Here's what should have happened. And when Ken Mantell left the promotion, in whatever year that was, that's when I knew the thing was in trouble.
So looking back on it, was it when David was still alive, or maybe there was an opportunity still after David had died, that's the moment that Fritz should have gone national?
Anytime through 1985, the early part of 85, Fritz had as great an opportunity to go worldwide as at any point. It was toward the end of 85, and certainly into 86, that window began to close.
Do you think that Fritz was nervous to send his kids out on the road because of some of the personal issues they might have had at the time?
That's a good question, and it could have easily been the case. I've never given that much thought. There were a lot of people who hovered nearby to take advantage of those boys in financial deals, in substance issues. So they were certainly in a vulnerable spot. And those boys, in their goodness, had a pretty high level of naivete, as well as some of the issues that stardom brings that added to that vulnerable nature. So that may well have been the case.
Do you think Fritz knew the problems that they had?
I think Fritz knew the problems that they had. And I think Fritz, and that's part of Fritz's struggle within himself, Fritz had many inner secrets about what did I not do or where did I go wrong. Fritz was regarded as this gruff, hard father, and he had that side, but Fritz was fiercely loyal. I saw that even in his relationship with me just as a young employee. He never raised his voice at me. He was kind and complimentary and patient with me when I really loused something up, and somebody else might have gotten a thorough dose of teeth marks in their behind. Fritz always treated me with grace. And I saw that in that relationship with those boys. He might yell and threaten, but Fritz loved them and was there for them and was at every track meet and football game and an event that they had and bringing friends and family to root for them. And Fritz was confused and saddened by their struggles. And as the boys got to a certain age, and as Fritz got to a certain age, Fritz began to just say, I'm not going to be there to bail them out anymore. And Fritz's relationship with the county judge or the justice of the peace or whoever the person was might have still been there, but he wasn't going to play that trump card anymore, and he started letting those boys begin to suffer the consequences of some of their choices. And I've wondered if that had happened 10 years, 15 years prior, if they wouldn't have grown up a little better.
Mark, sitting there in 82, 83, even 84, you weren't in on the inner circle, but did you suspect that things were going on with some of the boys?
Yes, I knew that some of that was going on. I had seen some things, and, you know, I just looked the other way and basically stayed out of it. It wasn't my business, so I just didn't make it my business.
Sure.
I did not realize until on later, back in the days when Jarrett had come in and actually bought the promotion, how horrific the narcotic and drug problem was. And if you look at the DVD that Brian Harrison did here a couple of years ago, when he not only deals with the Von Erichs, but he does that memorial piece at the end on the graphic where he just lists the names of all those good-looking, young, capable guys that came through that office, guys younger than I am now, who are dead as the results of alcohol and substance abuse. It's absolutely chilling. And for me to have known, I mean, I was a guy who was wrestling with the call to ministry and spent the last several years of my relationship with him in seminary and actually pastoring a small church. To know that I was that close to that, boy, that sends chills up and down my back.
Do you think in retrospect anything could have been done to change the situation, or was it just these are young kids, they got a lot of money, girls love them, a lot of temptation, and what's going to be is going to be?
Now, you're opening a dangerous door there for me to start preaching, and you don't want that. So, and I know that, so I won't. But what I'm saying to you in hindsight is, had that opportunity, the opportunity of 82, 83, 84, for that thing to go big, had you brought in the management that had been necessary to lead and promote, you could have offered some coaching and some guidance and some boundaries for those guys that could have not prevented it, but could have maybe helped it and minimized the negative impact. We've seen that in Major League sports, but it's a lesson that has had to be learned in recent years. Stuff went unchecked for so many years that now is being monitored. And so that kind of effort could have taken place then, but, at that point, this was all new territory.
Sure. World Class was ahead of its time for sure, especially with that broadcast being syndicated all over the country. Mark, you talked about Fritz. He didn't want to go into other people's territory physically, but he was bringing the show into other people's territory, and it was basically making their shows look bad. Even Vince McMahon in '83, the world-class broadcast was shown in Boston on Channel 25. I remember thinking this is just head and shoulders above WWF.
And we went to Boston one year. I flew up there twice, I think.
Were you at the first Lynn? Was it in Lynn, Massachusetts?
Lynn Municipal Stadium.
What was the attendance? What did it look like?
Well, it was good. It wasn't great. I remember flying up there, and Ken Mantell was very, very excited about the fact that the promotion was doing that. But there was frustration that they had settled for the Lynn Municipal Stadium. There were other places that they could have gone. Ken had that thing ready to go to the Boston Garden. And, the rent was too high, or it was some little old thing that Ken thought was just ridiculous. And he felt like going to the Lynn Stadium was like peeking through the door instead of kicking the door in, which is, more his approach.
Why? Now, we spoke earlier that Fritz didn't want to go national. Was it because Vince was coming into Texas and then Fritz just said, what made that decision to go into Lynn?
I don't know why they agreed to do that.
And you were there, and was it a financial success or did it flop?
I think it was a financial success because I was well taken care of, and that was an indication of that. I usually got a flat rate for what I did based on whatever it was, but when we had the big shows, the Reunion Arena Star Wars or what have you, then I would get a little bit of the gate, and so if I remember well, that was a success.
And it wasn't followed up on. I remember there was the East Coast tour, and then there was no more until I think the next year, or maybe even the year after World Class came into. Were you at the Manchester, New Hampshire show?
I don't think so,
because by then it had died down quite a bit. Now, Gino Hernandez and Chris Adams, they had an incredible match in the Cotton Bowl with the Von Erichs. Texas wrestling was still pretty hot, but then Gino turns on Chris, or Chris turns on Gino, and Gino suddenly dies. Did you know at that point this thing is in big trouble?
No, at that point I just saw that as another sad chapter. I knew there were going to be consequences, but I would say, Gary, it would be fair to say that that's when I really started getting worried.
Yeah, I remember that's when I actually started to watch Channel 11. You guys were on C-band satellite. Did you know a lot of people were watching you all over the world?
Yes. In fact, I was using some language to describe that and got called on it. Don't say Superstation. Don't say around the world. Just talk about Fort Worth and Channel 11. And so I did, and I never knew what the reason was.
Because, like I said earlier, at the time, Channel 11, it was like a WTBS or a WGN. It was broadcast sent by satellite all over the world, and it was amazing to see those shows. But I remember when you announced that Gino had died, I thought, this is starting to get a little bit dark. And then, of course, Kerry got in his accident, and again, Mike Von Erich, which was a tragedy. Do you think with Mike, there's been a lot of conjecture over the years that Fritz forced all the boys into wrestling? I find that hard to believe. I would think they'd be naturals for the business. Do you think in the case of Mike that there was an issue of Fritz forcing it?
I am not a good person to ask that question to. I'll answer it, but my answer may not have a whole lot of credibility. I think that Fritz would have been just fine with Mike and Chris pursuing other roles within that promotion or their own lives had they so chosen. Again, I could be wrong, but I suspect that.
Watching Mike wrestle, did you think that he, you saw him up close, did you think he had business being in the ring?
I thought there was a place for Mike, but putting him in immediately as a star with his physical condition and his weight and size against people like the Fabulous Freebirds and others that he was put against was an absolute disgrace to the talent level of those other people and a hindrance to the credibility we were seeking. And I don't say that in any way personal against Mike Atkinson, a good, sweet human being. That's just my analogy of the fact that he was there. And that sounds like I'm opposing what I just said earlier. I think Fritz would have been fine had Mike gone a different way. But once he wanted in there, Fritz was going to then give him the same shot that those boys had, and it just wasn't the same.
Now, when Kerry got injured, were you aware of the severity of the injury?
We were kept in the dark on that, but I got some private information. I was close enough to the key people at that point that I could ask questions and they would give me an honest answer. So I was pretty well told what happened and how we needed to handle it, and I respected that and did that. The only thing that I did not realize is that that foot was pretty much hopeless.
I remember during the time, Kerry was he still couldn't get around that well. He was still on crutches, and there was a match scheduled. I don't know if you remember this, but against Brian Adidas. And he came out limping, and I thought to myself, he's got no business getting in the ring. Do you remember that before his official comeback?
Yes, I vaguely remember that.
Did you think that how is he going to get in the ring?
Well, you're never sure in the pro wrestling business what is reality and what isn't. I mean, here's a person who's been injured who comes down in a wheelchair for a TV interview, who, while his opponent is nonchalant in the ring, jumps out of the wheelchair and eats his lunch. So, you watch that and you wonder what's going on. And so you have to watch the crutches and, gee, is this for real? Is this really that bad? And you didn't want it to be. And so it took time for that reality to set in. Does that make sense?
It does. I just remember at that time thinking that I know he's been in a serious accident. It was only maybe 6 months after he was injured. As the story goes, and I don't know, supposedly they shot at his foot full of what was left of it or whatever, full of Novocaine before that match. He went out. Were you at the match?
Yes, I remember that, and it went okay. It wasn't a debacle, but it clearly wasn't the Kerry we had remembered. And and you may need to correct me, you may know more about this than I do, because my memory is fading at this advanced age that you have brought up so quickly in this time.
Okay.
I think then after that is when they went back and removed the foot.
Yeah, that's what I've heard.
And then once he actually got that, whatever you might call it, prosthesis may be the word, I'm not a doctor, then it really was better. He was better with that. Not the same, but good enough that he could get by. And the rest of his body looked great.
Yeah.
And so he still had a chance.
Did you know when he made the official comeback after the Adidas match that the foot was gone?
No, it was a little while after that
Okay.
that I realized that the foot was gone.
I think it's amazing how well he wrestled in that condition.
Oh, I agree.
I don't know what type of bracing they used, but he wasn't 100%, but maybe 85, 90?
I think so, yeah. And when the rest of you looks that good and you have that reputation, he could have lived with that.
At that time, Mark, attendance started to really drop. There were Texas Stadium shows with 7,000, 8,000, 9,000 people. What were you starting to hear?
I don't remember a real dramatic decline in attendance until the spring of 1986. And even so, you could cover that by saying that everything runs in a cycle, and in the business of pro wrestling, you have certain peaks where you have a lot going on, and then you go back and you rebuild again. And so it could be sloughed off under that guise. But in August of 86, the bottom dropped out of it. And I remember a dramatic change in energy, feeling from the crowd, not only by the numbers, but in what they were feeling as they watched. And that's when I said, uh-oh.
I remember you doing commentary on the Saturday night shows, and you'd actually have to ask people to come out. You were in what arena were you in? It was the big one.
Yeah, the Channel 11 show was always shot in the Will Rogers Coliseum, unless there was some event that moved us over into one of the adjoining buildings. And that building seats about 5,000, 5,500, but with seats on the floor, the capacity was well over 6,000.
Yeah, and I remember with the 11,000 seats, you'd get on the air and you'd kind of, I wouldn't say beg, but ask nicely for people to come out so that the events could stay in that arena. And you could see by the camera shots that things were starting to really go in the wrong direction.
Absolutely.
Did you left for a while. Was that in 87 or 88?
No, I stayed straight through.
Okay.
Yeah, I was with him for 10 years. In fact, when I stepped out of that and kind of retired, and that's what I did, I wasn't mad at anybody. I had been with him for 10 years because I started in June of 80, and I said goodbye at the end of May or the 1st of June of 1990.
When Jerry Jarrett came in to take over, what were your initial impressions?
Well, we were very encouraged. Ken Mantell had come back to the Fritz promotion and had helped orchestrate what I thought was going to be a partnership. And then once Mr. Jarrett got a hold of it, Jarrett looked for ways to bring the thing into a financially solvent situation again, because evidently it was bleeding pretty badly financially. And the high-priced talent, including Ken Mantell himself, disappeared quietly and quickly. And Jarrett began using a lot of the long-time talent that he had used in Tennessee. Jerry is a bright guy, a talented guy. He was very proud of his psychology degree, and Jerry was a master manipulator. And Jerry was a good persuader. And I remember he had me out to his apartment that he was keeping out in Valley Ranch one morning to tell me that he was cutting my salary in half. And it really wasn't a very pleasant day, and he thought he was packaging that in a very persuasive way, but it made me mad. And that's when I knew that it was time for me to begin making other plans, because by then I was well in seminary. I knew where my career was going, but I had hoped to stay with it a while, especially if it did well. And that was in the summer of 89, and by the spring of 90, I was ready to say thank you. It's been great.
And once you left, things, it just wasn't the same, Mark. And even, Jarrett had a magic to him, and that is that he could take wrestlers that weren't stars and make them semi-stars, somebody like an Eric Embry, and get quite a bit out of them.
And I agree with that.
And the promotion came back for a while, was doing well. It didn't. So you weren't around. You really don't know why Jerry didn't last in Texas, do you?
Well, see, I was in on all of the Eric Embry stuff, and we kind of had a renaissance. We weren't going to Fort Worth anymore, and the syndicated show had changed a little bit, and the Channel 11 show was being taped, I think, on Saturday mornings in Dallas. We were still doing a syndicated show on Friday nights, and then he was letting people in free on Saturday morning, and we were doing a Channel 11 taping. And things were going better. There was definite improvement. Nothing like we had seen back in those burgeoning years, but it was better. And when I left, we were at that point And when I left and went on my way. And evidently, things unravel quickly, and I'm reluctant to elevate myself into saying that I had a whole lot to do with that. I suspect that Channel 11 was already concerned because the promotion had changed hands. We weren't dealing with Yvonne Eriks. We weren't in Fort Worth at Will Rogers. I think my departure may have just triggered a process that was already beginning to gain momentum. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because I remember at the time Craig Johnson took over, and he was competent to some level, but it just wasn't the same. And then soon thereafter, the show actually switched to a World Wrestling Federation program, and that was the last time I tuned into Channel 11 from Texas. I think that it had something to do with it. It was odd, though, because at first, Jarrett, it was like a minor league world class from 82 or 83. He did have some momentum there. It just didn't last. Maybe too much cost cutting.
Yes, Jerry, like I say, is a likable, talented, creative, capable guy, and I really loved his son. I thought Jeff was a prince of a guy, and I'm glad to see he's done so well. But I think Jerry had more of an opportunity there had he not been so penny conscious, because you had a great heritage, you had a great area, you still had some great stuff, and if he had been willing to use a Bill Mercer, if he had stuck with me, maybe there was some credibility there. But again, I didn't leave because of any animosity. I left because I knew it was time for me to go on with what the Lord had called me to do. But I do think that Jerry may have missed an opportunity to do more than what he did.
Have you kept in touch with people like Gary Hart and Mickey Grant over the years?
No, and I never really knew Mickey all the time I was there. I would see him and say hey and visit with him briefly, but I was never in the inner circle, so Mickey and I were never close. Gary got upset, as you probably know, when Ken Mantell was hired in whatever year that was. And Gary came back, but Gary and I had a good relationship, but Gary never wanted a real friendship. And, of course, Gary passed away here a year or so ago rather suddenly. And Bronco Lubitsch passed away, and so I really haven't kept up with many of them. I've heard from Eric Embry. I've heard from Bill Moody, who was Percy Pringle, and I've reconnected with Bill Mercer over the last couple of years. Talked to Akbar a few times, but that's about it.
You said earlier there were a few people who had been involved in World Class who really felt let down by Fritz that he didn't take the promotion national. Is there anyone in particular that was just, you could just see that they were hurt so much by that?
Well, the number one guy would be Ken Mantell. Ken was the visionary, and master manipulator can be seen in a negative way. I mean that in a very positive way when I describe Ken. Ken was excellent. He was outstanding. And he's the guy, number one, who really felt like this was just a horrible atrocity. David Manning was another one. Those were the guys. And, you know, even when that thing was burgeoning, Gary, in the early 80s, the office staff was still much like it was when it was still a little regional promotion. And these guys were working incredible amounts of hours to be doing what was going on. And there was such a need for support staff and secretarial help and telemarketing and product stuff, you know, that the whole thing was just a missed opportunity.
Do you wish it had taken off, or would it have affected what you're doing now? Do you think you still would have gone down the same road?
I think so. I'm the happiest guy in the world. I love life. I love people. I've got great boys. I love what I'm doing. There isn't anything else on this planet that I want to do besides being a United Methodist minister. I like loving people and making a contribution to make life a better place. So, you know, that's where I am. Had it been different, would I be different? I honestly don't know.
Yeah. Well, the opportunity for Fritz was there. We'll never know what happened. It's fun to relive these things and to find out, you know, what some of the behind-the-scenes thinking was at the time. A lot of people I speak with think that Vince McMahon of the WWF was destined to be the number one guy. And I've found through these interviews that if things had played out a little bit differently, that might not have been the case.
Yes, and I don't know. I've never met the man. Have great respect for him. Wish him well. I just don't know.
Do you watch wrestling at all today?
I really don't, Gary, and much of that is because it has changed so much. You may have heard the term kayfabe.
Yeah.
Familiar with that?
Yeah.
Well, kayfabe passed away. That was the subtle death in the midst of all the other deaths that were making the headlines that never got recognized. And it used to be when you got hit in the head with a steel chair and they carried you out of the ring, we didn't see you for 6 weeks to 3 or 4 months because that was a big deal. And now you get hit in the head with a chair and are out cold and you're back as a heroic victor in the match in just a few minutes. It has changed.
Mark, I'm not sure how young your boys are, but if you had young kids today, would you let them watch it?
Well, I'm sure they probably will, and my oldest son is 11, and he's seen some of my old tapes and, enjoys them. In fact, I've taken him to some of the live events that we have gone to over the last couple of years where Bill Mercer and I have been brought back, just little small spot shows. And he finds great delight in it, but, he doesn't have passion for it.
I'm talking more about the Vince product with some of the R-rated stuff he puts on.
See, since I don't watch, I'm not even aware enough to know.
Okay, you're in good shape then. You're not missing much, okay?
Yeah.
Mark, did you ever think about going in the 90s to go work with Vince? Or
no, never gave it another thought.
That was it. Goodbye. Yeah. And today you're a United Methodist minister. You've been so since...
Well, I took my first church in 1989. So what year is this? This is 2009, so I'm celebrating my 20th year.
Do you look out and see a lot of what you believe were wrestling fans from the 1980s? Do you wonder about that, or do they say something to you?
I don't really get seen a whole lot. People do have a long memory. Sometimes it happens in weird places. I was out at the ballpark in Arlington with my father. Now, this has been several years ago. But we were watching the Ranger game, and I needed to go to the restroom. So I get up and go to the men's room, and as I come out the portal and out into the concourse to turn and go in the restroom, this guy is staring at me. And it's one of those eyes glued on you gazes where you know he thinks he knows you. Well, when I come back out of the restroom, he's standing there still staring, and he approaches me and he says, "It's you. You're the guy. You're Marc Lowrance. You're the guy on wrestling. Oh, man, I can't believe it. You were great on there." And he goes through this litany of accolades. My chest is just puffed, and I'm all happy. He says, "Oh, that was so great. I grew up watching that. So wonderful. Hey, man, what are you doing now?" he said with excitement. And with delight and pride, I said, "Well, friend, I'm a United Methodist minister now." And his face just dropped, and his gaze dropped to the concrete, and with compassion, he looked at me and said, "Oh, man, I'm sorry. What happened?" So with that audience, there wasn't anything any greater than that.
Mark, I want to thank you. It's been a pleasure. And, look, you were a great commentator because I listened to you almost every Saturday night, at least when I didn't have a date. And, I really enjoyed what you did, and you brought a great style and class to the broadcast. And I really wish things had worked out a little bit differently for World Class because I think that Fritz had lightning in a bottle back then.
Oh, I agree. And you're very complimentary, way too kind. And if I can ever be of any help or encouragement to you or do more of this again, you give me a holler.
Thank you so much, Mark.
All right.
Talk to you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.